Hello, hello, family. Welcome, welcome to this amazing presentation. Today, this is our third in a fourth series of our Ancestor Month celebrations. I hope you can all join us tomorrow for our final Black History Month event, an interfaith discussion on the role of the ancestors. Joining us today is Victoria Moyo Snowden. This is Historical Grief and Deathkeeping. I will put our flyer for tomorrow's presentation in the chat in a little bit. So let's get started. Born and raised in Southwest Georgia, Victoria Moyo Snowden is a death doula and full spectrum birth worker, which allows her to help families within the full spectrum of life and death. In addition, she is trained as an end-of-life planner, grief specialist, dementia doula, crisis coordinator, herbalist, yoga teacher, and meditation teacher. Her goals include reclaiming and restoring honor and respect in aging and death to clients and their families. In addition to her grief and death work services, Victoria conducts extensive research into fields such as pregnancy and infant loss and bereavement, Alzheimer's disease and dementia, death culture in African American communities, autistic aging and death studies, and American genealogical studies. In addition to all of these accomplishments, Mama Moyo is our Jabari's teacher and mentor in a cohort of death keepers from an African American's perspective through her 2024 Guided Cycles training. I'll put Mama Moyo's website in the chat. I encourage you all to take a look at her services page, which is filled with amazing opportunities to learn more and be a part of her circles and education. Without further ado, Mama Moyo, please share with us.
Thank you. Thank you for that beautiful introduction. So let's get started, y'all. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Let's see. There you go. Is anybody involved in death work in any capacity already, or interested in being involved in death work?
I know our Jabari is.
I am as well.
Love it.
And dearest family, Mama Moyo is open to questions throughout the presentation. So if there are questions or comments that come to you, please, you can raise your virtual hand or get our attention and we will acknowledge you. Thank you.
Yeah, I would just like to understand it a little more before I can say yes or no.
Okay. All right. Got some interest and just some people wanted to know a little bit more. Okay. So yeah, hopefully we accomplish that today, right? All right, let me put this over here. So we just actually came off the heels of a 2-day teach-in a couple of weeks ago. That was all about us talking about death work and grief from an African Afrocentric perspective. So yeah, I already had that beautiful introduction, so I really appreciate it. Thank you. So yeah, in reference to death keeping, so since a lot of people are kind of new to the space or feel like they're new, a lot of times I like to start from the very beginning, right? And talk about, first off, what is culture? What is culture in general? Which culture can be defined and expressed as all of the different ways of life and behaviors of a population or a community that are passed down from generation to generation. Basically, culture is what we refer to as a lot of the learned values and social norms. And, usually in class, we have people just go and just talk about the different categories that a lot of times I pull up and think about different examples, right? So what does culture mean to you in reference to family, in reference to a region, a society, ethnically, workplace, subculture, also spiritual and religious cultures, right? Um, but I also have some examples for you, right? So an example of familial culture is some of the holiday celebrations we have, right? Different families a lot of times have different holiday celebrations. There's different rituals and rites that a certain family may celebrate around birth, around their marriages, and death, which of course we're going to talk about a lot more in depth as we go along. And also language, the different types of languages we have. Oh, that's beautiful. Um, Also ethnic culture, a lot of us, even though we are all of African descent, there is a lot of different cultures based on the different types of ethnicities we belong to. Black American definitely has ample culture, despite what you might hear, in other circles. There's a plethora of different cultural beliefs and values and norms that Black Americans have. Also Haitian culture. We have Puerto Rican culture, being, Afro-Latino, Nigerian, Kenyan, Brazilian. We come from all over the globe, right? Because, the boat stopped all over the globe. And so we were able to establish cultures everywhere, right? Then we have regional cultures, such as there's different community celebrations that we may have in the different communities, different foods that we might eat, based on the businesses that come into our community. A lot of times that helps us form certain cultures. The dialect that we speak, we might all speak English, in the United States, and the majority of us might speak English, but because we bring a lot of our own personal cultures and, you know, uh, in reference to the different areas that we live at, then that affects the way that we speak. Um, and then just like we are belonging to different ethnicities, we also establish different cultures in the different regions that we're in. So Black Appalachian, Black Alabaman, a Black Georgian, and a Black Baltimorean all are going to have different types of cultures, right? There's different types of things that we do based on where we live um, and grow up. Some examples of spiritual and religious culture are initiations, right? Baptisms. Some people may belong to different traditions and religious beliefs in which they may, want to get an annual divination, especially at the end of the year or the beginning of each year. There might be traditional types of clothing that you need to wear for different types of rites and rituals. And also just the way that you speak with spiritual elders. A lot of times it's going to be different based on your religion or your spiritual tradition, right? And then workplace culture. A lot of times people don't think about culture in the workplace, but it's definitely cultures in the workplace. Like, what are the different types of policies that are in different types of workplaces? What are what's the dress code like? What are some holidays that you are able to take off for and rest? Um, Same thing with school culture. Um, Same thing with regional culture. Well, we talked about regional culture, right? Subcultures. So some of the subcultures, a lot of times that is a culture that, society that is kind of like the minority in society, or kind of clashes with some of the mainstream beliefs and norms in the general society. So some of um, the different types of spiritualities and religions that are not as commonly practiced or talked about in mainstream societies, which a lot of times for us being in ATRs and ADRs would be considered to be part of a subculture. Different types of political systems, little hobby groups like anime. Anime definitely has a culture, a community, and even people who are choosing to school their kids differently, homeschoolers, being a part of a homeschooling family. And also, like I say, societal culture. So that is encompassing the different types of foods and languages and holidays and fashion and religion that a society may celebrate in as a whole, right? So those are just some examples of culture in general for those different areas. So now that we have a better understanding of culture and how culture is so encompassing of our entire way of being in our society, then we want to talk about death culture. So death culture is an expression of how a group of people value and communicate death and remember the dead. That is a general definition for death culture. So now we want to look back at all of those different types of things that we talked about, like family and regional and societal, ethnic, workplace, subculture, spiritual and religious culture. Like, what does death culture mean to you in all of those different types of spaces, which you can put in the chat, some of your examples, right? But I also have, examples as well. So in the family space for death culture, funeral homes, there's a lot of people, particularly in the Black community, we have established relationships with particular types of funeral homes that we use generation after generation. Also, end of life planning. What does it look like? What does end of life planning look like in your family? Is end of life planning happening in your family? That is part of culture too, right? Also, ethnic death culture, rest in peace shirts is particularly popular, especially amongst Black Americans, wearing, shirts with someone who has passed. So that is something that we talk about. Tabitha says death rites, lighting candles, praying for their elevation and evolution. Yeah,
Victoria, it looks like we have a question from Tabitha. Would you like to take that question now?
I did. What was the question?
She's got her virtual hand raised.
Oh, okay. Sure, go ahead.
The question I had is that within my family, it's somewhat of a struggle, particularly with elders, to have the conversation. Right now, my brother had passed away, so it's even more important for me, at least for my parents that are approaching their 80s, but they don't want to have the conversation. And my dad is from the South, so it's even more so like if they have the conversation, the belief that something is going to happen to them. But I'm like, you're in your mid 80s, chances
Mhm.
are it's going to happen. Do you have any recommendations on how to maybe to approach the conversation? If you're familiar with old school, like Southern ways, if this sounds familiar to any, like, I don't
Yeah, absolutely. So
know.
let's circle back to that. Let me go through
Thank
this and we're going to circle back to that. Okay. Let me put it down so I can remember to get back to it. Okay. Coach, as a Jew Israelite, we sit Shiva and lighting candles at the funeral and spend a year mourning and remembering the ancestors yearly. Love that. Right. So, yeah, so with familial death culture, talked about funeral homes, end of life planning, and like I say, ethnic death culture, rest in peace shirts is really popular, particularly in some parts of the United States. New Orleans jazz funerals. We'll talk a little bit more about New Orleans jazz funerals, but they're very distinct, right? Oh, they have jazz bands, which is not, something that a lot of other funerals may have. Spiritual and religious death culture, a homegoing. Homegoings is very popular, particularly in Black American communities, which often have like a Christian service, right? And just having a spiritual leader attached, to funerals in general, right? Minister, whether you have priest or priestess. Workplace death culture. So policies exist in the workplace in reference to who you can take off for, as far as in some workplaces, If it's not an immediate family member, then you're expected to come to work, right? Like if it's like a cousin, like you still need to come to work. There's not any time that you're going to be able to get off, right? So that is a particular type of culture in reference to death that a lot of times workplaces establish, like who is worthy of being able to be honored and grieved, and who is like, okay, you got to go on with everyday life. School death culture. We now live in a society where our kids, they have to make as part of their daily going to school, what to do if a school shooter comes to their school, right? So a lot of times they have to do these different drills to get prepared in case something happens like that. Also regional, we talked about regional death culture, such as regional funeral homes, obituaries, the ways that obituaries are looked at in your different communities. Also death subcultures, like what are some things that we do in ATRs and ADRs. The horror community, I teach, some classes in reference to horror and death. Alternative communities, and also societal death culture. So as a society, particularly Black, American society in general, a lot of times there is that disconnection to death, right? Like it's something that a lot of times in a lot of different spaces we don't talk about. It has a very finite space for grief. And some deaths get honored and some don't, right? And we tend to learn socially like what deaths are acceptable to talk about in society and what deaths are not, and there's like a lot of shame a lot of times that come with that. All right. So yeah, I did talk a little bit about New Orleans jazz funerals, right? When we talked about regional death culture. So in general, we think about New Orleans as the birthplace of jazz. A lot of these jazz funerals have like, West African roots because a lot of us have a lot of West African origin, right? And we'll talk a little bit more about it, but in general, for a lot of people in this region and for a lot of other people, a lot of our other ancestors, death for us meant the mark of newfound freedom, especially because our our ancestors were enslaved, right? So there was a lot so that bondage. A lot of times they thought about, okay, well, we might be even though, of course, we had those different rebellions and we had those different escapes, there was still a lot of emphasis put on death. Like, okay, we may be in bondage right now, but death a lot of times is going to, be our liberation. That's going to be ways that we can finally get peace and finally get rest. Also, jazz funerals, they come with parades, right? Those band leaders who are playing jazz all the way to the funeral. A lot of times it's very somber music. And then after the funeral takes place, a lot of times the music becomes more lively, it's more upbeat, people are dancing, and that is, symbolizing that, that person has, found that freedom that we talked about, right? Then we also have fantasy coffins. In Ghana, there's a whole just group of people, the group of artists. So it's part of deaf culture, and art can be part of the deaf culture as well. So in Ghana, there's like some people who are particularly trained in creating these particular types of coffins that often capture the essence of the departed. For example, in the background, I don't know if you can see it, distinctly, but it is a fish that they created. And so that person who probably died was probably a fisherman or was tied to the water in some kind of way. But in Ghana, death is a transition to the spiritual realm of ancestors who are still part of living families. The Southern Ghana-based God people believe that life continues on in death, as we will talk about. A lot of other groups of people of African descent also believe. And properly honoring the deceased secures spiritual favor for the family left on earth. A lot of these beliefs are going to be shared throughout, different groups of people of African descent. Have anybody ever seen some of these fantasy coffins in Ghana before?
I've only seen them online. I've never seen them in person.
Yes. Did somebody have a question? I see somebody said something about a question.
Tamika made a comment in the chat, said, looking for unique ways to celebrate a family member who passed away by suicide. He was an elder.
Okay, let's come back to that. So, in reference to proper burials in African traditions, proper burials ensure that the ancestor doesn't remain behind to hunt and exert power over the living. Instead, the departed can focus on resting in peace in their new role as an ancestor in the afterlife. A lot of times, people believe that an improper burial results in ghosts or haints that stay in the world of the living and often cause harm. And some who are considered undeserving may intentionally be denied proper burials so that they will not be honored as ancestors in their afterlife and their souls can be stuck. So these are what I would say are examples of Africanisms in certain parts of our community. And we'll talk some more about some other Africanisms, right? So particularly in reference to death work here in America for Black folks, one of the things that we have documented is that a lot of times funerals were directly affected by the plantation work schedule, and they were usually held on Sundays, which for a lot of plantations, it was the sole day of rest that the enslaved were often offered. Also, kind of going back to what we were talking about earlier, a lot of West African death practices and African American enslaved funerals both often had a second funeral, which happened sometimes weeks or months, sometimes as long as a year after an actual burial. And this second burial is often celebratory in nature. We'll see in a lot of our different histories that a lot of times the first type of event that we have for a person is like a memorial, is very somber, and then a lot of times later on we'll have a more celebratory event to kind of mark that, okay, this person has moved on, whether it's into ancestorhood, whether it's into whatever type of freedom that they have, and we try to celebrate them. So grief and joy a lot of times go hand in hand for us. So also here in America, death was usually handled by the grand midwives. So, as a birth worker, a lot of times I talk about the history of the grand midwives in birth work, but they also connect to death work because they were not just catching babies, right? They were also, in general, a lot of grand midwives were herbalists. They were, heavily involved as spiritual leaders. And so they were also a lot of times genealogists. They were also historians. They were often involved in not only doing births and fertility work, but also abortion work. They were also involved in helping to keep track of where different people were buried. Because a lot of times on plantations, we were buried, in unmarked graves, off to the side, where nobody was supposed to be able to find us. And so a lot of grand midwives was very instrumental in keeping track of different family members, family trees, not only in reference to burials, but a lot of times, because we know that people were constantly sold off to other plantations. A lot of times, grand midwives were very instrumental in keeping track of where people were located, right? So very important in genealogy work as well. So these home funerals and the fact that a lot of times we were buried at home was the norm all the way up until the Civil War. And we'll get to the Civil War a little bit more as well, but also with the unmarked graves. A lot of times we had grave markers, some of the grave markers can look a variety of different ways. A lot of times they were personal items that were left on the burials. They may be something called inkisi dolls, which was put there, which would have certain types of deities, certain types of spirits, or maybe certain type of work involved with the inkisi dolls. And there were also face jugs. A lot of times face jugs were very instrumental in marking different graves. Face jugs could be found along the routes of the Underground Railroad and at different grave sites. A lot of times it indicated how highly the people were valued to their community and how closely connected they were with their own culture, right? So the face jugs could look a different type. This is an example of a face jug, but a lot of times there were actual the jug was created to have like an actual face on it. And the face it symbolized a lot of different things. It could be very ugly, supposed to be ugly in nature to scare away, certain types of other spirits. Or it could be something that was very intimately connected with their own lineage, right? So going back to why the Civil War was instrumental for why we don't have funerals at home anymore, right? Because now we know that we mostly work with funeral homes. Whereas, like I say, before the Civil War, most of when people died got buried at the house. So the marked shift in American funerals from intimate family affairs to more commercialized and public rituals, it began at the Civil War because the Civil War resulted in over 600,000 deaths, which was the largest amount of deaths from a war that had happened, since the United States had been established. And so a lot of the Union soldiers, of course, were far away from home. And so they had to figure out what was going to be, what to do with them. And a lot of the people who took care of the bodies of the different people who were being killed in the war were Black soldiers. Black soldiers a lot of times were responsible for removing dead bodies from the battlefields and keeping records of who was where that they decided to bury them, and all kinds of things. So because they were not only the soldiers who were supposed to be part of the battle, but also removing the dead bodies, they also start becoming skilled in some of the things that was popularized around that time, which was embalming. Embalming was necessary to preserve the bodies of Union soldiers who were killed in the South so that they could be shipped back home for services and burial in the North. So because the Black soldiers and other Black assistants start becoming really involved in embalming, that also allowed them to really take that skill with them in other ways, especially, after the war, right? Because especially after the Civil War, once a lot of other people start realizing hey, how is this body still so well preserved after, they were killed days or weeks ago? Embalming really took off after the Civil War. And the Black soldiers and Black assistants, who were the ones who were mostly in charge of collecting those bodies and taking care of those bodies and shipping those bodies back, they became, a huge part of the death industry. So even though, slavery and as far as legally was, had supposedly ended, of course, we know about the Jim Crow era and all the other things that Black people had to deal with. So even though there was a rise of Black funeral directors, there was still a lot of that they had to contend with, such as the separate cemeteries, right? The white funeral directors didn't want to have anything at first to do with Black people. And until they start seeing the different types of culture that we had, right? Because as I explained before, Black death culture is really, really focused on honoring people in death. And the fact that, a lot of times death for a lot of our different cultures signifies freedom. And so there was a lot of attention put on deaths as far as a lot of people, even to this day, if somebody dies, a lot of friends and family are going to come and gather, right? And then the funeral is going to be a big event. We want to know who's doing the body. We want to know what types of food's going to be there, making sure that they looking good, having all types of just wonderful things happen as far as the sermons and music and celebrations. So there was a lot of energy, that was put into Black funerals that was, that looks really different from white funerals. So a lot of times the white funeral directors were kind of looking sideways, like, yeah, like there's a lot of money that these people are putting into these funerals. So they start coming up with ways to try to get Black clients, like be like, okay, well, we'll serve you, but you got to come through the back door, or maybe you got to go through the basement. You got to come after hours, things like that, which some Black people, they went with, because some people still thought that, to work with white funeral directors was going to be better than working with Black funeral directors. But the interesting thing about Black funeral directors is that, not only did that, become a major occupation in the Black community, but also they were involved in um, a lot of political movements, such as with the civil rights movements. A lot of times activists, they were allowed, if they weren't coming to churches to do their activist work, a lot of times they were allowed to go to the Black funeral homes and meet there at the funeral homes to do, to plan boycotts and protests and things like that. Also at funeral homes, a lot of times, not funeral homes, but at the funerals themselves, a lot of times they incorporated a lot of political protests, such as having instructions, when we were trying to get our rights to vote. A lot of times on the promotional fans, they'll have the instructions on what to do in order to vote on the promotional fans. So they'll have political figures such as Martin Luther King Jr. or Malcolm X. They'll have them on the fans. So there was different ways that Black funeral directors also were able to help support a lot of the work that we were doing, whether it was a civil rights movement or whatever, right? So one of the first Black funeral directors was Prince Greer. That was his name, which is a picture of him. He was employed as an assistant to a man named W.R. Cornelius. And like I say, embalming became popularized around the Civil War. But not only was it popularized around the Civil War because of the soldiers, it was popularized around around that time because of the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. That also contributed to the popularization of embalming, because they actually did a 20-day funeral for Abraham Lincoln in a lot of multiple different cities. And so a lot of people were impressed by, you know, how preserved his body was during that time. So that also contributed to why embalming became so, it took off so. But yeah, funeral parlors were among the first businesses opened by Black people after slavery was abolished. Also around the 1900s, Black churches began forming burial societies, which helped in collecting money from church members to pay for funerals, coffins, and graves. And so, yeah, Black funeral homes began opening their doors at this time because there was now money to support these businesses. Also, somebody who's really important to Black death work and talking about funeral directors is a woman named Miss Henrietta Dutier. She was among America's first African-American funeral home owners, and she the first American woman to own a mortuary, and she was also a philanthropist and abolitionist who also worked with the Underground Railroad. So as we can see, a lot of funeral directors were not only major part, you know, of the businesses and working in their occupation, but they were also very much instrumental in doing a lot of social and political work, right? And talked about that, about the promotional fans and just other different ways that they were able to implement political work in death culture and the funerals. So earlier I mentioned Africanism. So if you don't, you know, if you don't know what Africanism is, that is what is referred to as a body of knowledge that is often passed down from the oldest living member of the community. It incorporates not only expressions and sayings and superstitions that relate to music and dance, but also religious beliefs and practices in the arts. So when we talk about Africanisms, especially in reference to death culture, we're talking about many of the stories and superstitions and just things that we talk about, you know, and that we believe as a community or as a tradition related to death and burials that are still told and believed today, right? So some of the ones, you know, that I mentioned earlier, as far as, you know, a proper burial, ensuring that, you know, a departed one doesn't become a ghost or a haint. The dead look out for their loved ones. Every effort must be made to carry out the wishes of the dead carefully, for if this is not done, the dead person can hunt the family or the individual responsible for going against his, her, or their wishes. When the individual is asleep, their spirit leaves their body. Therefore, if you harass them and if they wake up before their spirit has returned, they will die. Some communities believe that if a dog howls or a rooster crows in the doorway, this is a sign someone will die. Don't kill a bluebird. This means bad luck. And if a spider descends on a string on his web, don't let him rise again, or else death will follow. Among some of the West African communities, an old saying existed about the need to dig a grave over several days because there's a danger that a fatigued worker may sweat, right, and allow a drop of sweat to fall in the excavation. And if there is a drop of sweat that falls inside of the excavation, then a ghost could utilize this to take with him the soul of the one who had labored too much. And if y'all can think of some different sayings in the chat, please put them in there, right? Some particular ones in African-American practices, but also other parts of our African diaspora and our African traditions in general is just the belief in animism, the belief that natural phenomena, and inanimate objects, and things have an innate soul or spirit. So whether we're talking about, plants, trees, just anything. Everything has spirit. Everything has a soul attached to it for a lot of people. Breaking dishes can release the spirit. That is another one that has been found in Black death culture. We talked about the second burial, right? Decoration of graves with household items or personal possessions. This reflects the belief that items are there for the spirit. For a lot of people, they believe that the soul actually leaves the body through the mouth. And also the importance of being buried facing east, especially in the deep south, to allow rising at Judgment Day. Otherwise, the person is in the crossways of the world. So those are just some different ones that we found throughout. Someone said, if you see an owl during the day, someone will soon transition. All right. So yeah, Black people die differently, right? When we're going back to earlier when we talked about culture and society as a whole, when we talk about different groups of people, and we're talking particularly about Black people, compared to white people, we die differently. A lot of times the ways that we die are going to be more violent, right? A lot of times we are subjected to murders, things like that, a lot more than compared to white people in our society. A lot of times we are dying prematurely or from diseases that probably could have been prevented a little bit longer or a lot longer because of a lack of equal access a lot of times to different resources that we need in the medical community. Black people live sicker lives and die younger than white people. Excuse me. Excuse me. And then there's a saying, right, that when white people catch a cold, Black folks get pneumonia, right? So basically any kind of issue that happens in society, a lot of times it's going to affect us more intensely than it does the white people in the community. Going back to what I was talking about with the lack of medical resources, we are subjected to medical terrorism. So during and after the days of slavery, the autopsies of deceased enslaved Africans were also a public event, right? So doctors and other medical staff made thousands, even millions of dollars of bringing the deceased mutilated bodies of Black people around to different facilities on nationwide tours. They will work on the autopsy little by little in different cities. And then often the finale, of the tour was the cause of death for the person. So these mob dissections, which were part of the underground market, well, that's one of the different deaths, but also another death that people were subjected to was called mob dissections. And this is where they would go and dig up bodies of formerly enslaved Black people back up and just dissect different parts of the body for monetary gain. So this wasn't always just done by doctors and medical staff. A lot of times they were just people who were able to get money from bringing our bodies to different places and certain parts of the body. A lot of times fetch, higher prices than other parts of the body, right? Corpses were technically considered the property of the enslavers, institutions, or state agencies for a very, very long time. If you have not heard of this book before, their price for their pound of flesh is a really, really good book by Dana Ramey Berry. And that is where some of that information that you don't really hear a lot of places come from. Yes, somebody said making the money even in death. Absolutely. Let's go back to Black maternal rates. So just talking more about, medical terrorism, right? Black women and other Black birthing people have an estimated almost 50% increased risk of miscarriage compared to white women and white birthing people. Black women and Black birthing people are 3 times more likely to die from a pregnancy-related cause than white women and other white birthing people. Then we have Black birthing people right now have 5 times the rate, the abortion rates for white birthing people. Also, the overall U.S. maternal mortality rates increased 33% overall during the pandemic, hitting Black birthing people the hardest, right? Somebody has a question. Go ahead, Ms. Beulah.
Yes, this rate of maternity mortality among Black women is really came as a shock to me, because it's only been recently that these statistics are kind of like coming out more and more. And I'm like, wow, because I've had 2 children. All my births were really easy. My oldest, I had him within about, I would say, 11 minutes of getting to the hospital, and there were no complications for him or me, with the birth. And then my youngest, I had him within about, I say, 45 minutes to arriving at the hospital. And I've never had any kind of prolonged labor pains or anything like that. It's like they just popped out. And I never felt like hospital staff or the nurses weren't doing, their job as far as caring for me before and after the birth. So it's like, I just never even heard of this until relatively recently.
Okay, well, I'm extremely happy that you had a positive experience. Unfortunately, your experience is a lot less common than you think, especially amongst people in the Black community. A lot of people have problems with medical staff not listening to them, listening to some of the complaints that they have a little too late, in which a lot of times they do have complications. And a lot of times when they're not listened to, or when different things are neglected a little too late, people they get sicker. A lot of people may die. There's a lot of infants die, and so that's where a lot of these statistics come from.
Well, I know my mother, altogether, she's had about 11 children, and except for I think the last 3 pregnancies, and she was having children like back in the 50s and the 60s. And except for the last 3 pregnancies, we were all delivered by the, what do you call them? The neighborhood birthing lady, right? And I know now today they're calling them doulas, and there's more going on now with the doulas and at-home birthing. I believe they're trying to bring that back, especially for Black women. And then I had a friend, and his mother had 16 children, and this was down in Mississippi, I believe, during the 50s and the 60s as well. And she survived, and evidently they all survived, So this is like, it's just surprising today.
Yeah, I think you brought up a good point about the fact that it sounds like a lot of them use midwives, which in today's society is now criminalized. A lot of those midwives that that we mentioned earlier in this presentation, a lot of those practicing midwives that were able to help birth so many of our ancestors and some of the different elders in our families, a lot of times, a lot of those same people are not allowed to practice under contemporary law because they have been criminalized, because they have not been intentionally and institutionally able to meet the new criteria of different laws and policies that the medical communities have established. Because now that Black people are, you know, are not, you know, institutionally enslaved anymore, they wanted to figure out a way for them to be able to get our money and profit off of us in other ways. And so since most of us were continuously going to midwives because those were the people that we trusted, those were the people we respected, they figured out a way to really criminalize a lot of the midwives in our community, which is why a lot of those midwives that we discuss and that we know our grandmothers or great grandmothers and great grandparents utilize, they were not able to practice after a certain amount of time.
Mm-hmm. So the doulas that are we're seeing today, they are meeting the criteria of the medical establishment, or is this still outside of the
Doulas are
medical
different from
establishment?
midwives. Doulas, they don't have the scope of what midwives had. So doulas, a lot of times they are able to do informational support, emotional support, spiritual support, but they're not the ones who are actually catching babies. They're not the ones that's doing medical exams. That's not the scope of a doula.
Okay. All right. But do you think the midwives will that be something that happens again under this system that we have right now, the present medical system?
Will they what now?
The midwives, will they make a return with the midwife? There are midwives today, aren't they?
There's still midwives available, but they are still the ones, the traditional midwives and the certified professional midwives, which a lot of times were the ones that were part of our communities, is still criminalized in a lot of states, including my state. So right now there's a lot of people who are involved in that advocacy work and that justice work. And of course, a lot of times we need as many people as possible on that ground. So that is what you can do if that is something that you're really interested in, is learn more about the advocacy work and justice work being done in these circles.
Okay.
Thank you for your comments, Beulah. Much appreciated.
Okay.
Yeah. So Black maternal mortality rates are, you know, a big issue in our communities, as we discussed, right? Also, when we're talking about historical death and grief in Black communities, lynchings was a huge part of it. Right now, we have over 6,000 documented cases of lynchings, and there's many, many more that have not been documented. But lynching was actually an institution here in America. It was definitely an institution. Everybody was involved in it. As far as everybody, when I say everybody, I mean judges, police officers, firefighters. There was not anywhere that people could go to find, refuge in from these lynchings, especially here in the Deep South. A lot of times when a community decided to lynch a person, a lot of times there would be a story put in a newspaper. That's to let you know, like, this wasn't something that just happened, like, instantaneously. Like, they would actually put it in a newspaper a lot of times to let the community know, hey, we're going to be lynching such and such on this date. Okay. A lot of times, parents were able to get their kids away out from school so that they can watch the lynching. Vendors would come in to sell food. They'd come to sell drinks. Like some newspaper would be there so they could have pictures. There'd also be other photographers because they would like to take a picture of the body so that you could have postcards, right, of the person and send them out. Like this was a whole institution. And also some of the mobsters, like some of the people, the vigilantes, they would often, like people weren't just lynched. They often were, there was different parts of the body that was cut off, right? We're talking about the ears, the fingers, part of the genitals. A lot of times they were kept as souvenirs, or they could be part of that underground market that we talked about earlier. A lot of times the body was set on fire even prior to the lynching. A lot of times this happened while they were completely still alive. And yes, lynchings are still ongoing. I know a couple of days ago that somebody in North Georgia was just found hanging from a tree. So this is something that is still ongoing in our communities. So bringing this up, not only for historical grief and talking about the other different things, but also talking about this in the framework of contemporary Black death justice. Contemporary Black death justice is the ways in which communities and populations are discriminated against and oppressed, leading to early and preventable deaths. And also just all of the different types of trauma, that is involved in our communities, right? So even though we are, all come from African descent, there's different types of deaths that may affect different parts of the community more so than others, right? So depending on, the aging population, the elder population, then there's marginalized ethnicities and racial groups within our communities. Marginalized there's different ethnicities that have certain deaths that are more common than other, ethnicities. Then we want to talk about gender, also neurodivergent and disabled populations. So those different types of intersections, for our communities are also really important when we're talking about death culture too, right? Birthwork, medical neglect, elder abuse and neglect, suicides, war, national conflict, genocides, all of that is also part of death work too. Also Black femicide, about 45% of Black girls and women have physical violence, sexual violence, or stalking by their intimate partner in their lifetime. Pregnant Black women are 11 times more likely to be victims of femicide than non-Black women, according to the Journal of Advanced Nursing. Black women have the highest homicide rates among females in the United States. They're killed at 4 times the rate of white and Hispanic women, usually by their intimate partner. So that is a conversation I like to have a lot of times, especially in birth work spaces, right? Also, Black people, who account for 13% of the population, account for 27% of those fatally shot and killed by police. When these statistics were generated in 2021, Black people are twice as likely to be shot and killed by police officers as white people, right? So we also know about that. So as we have had this conversation, talking about lynchings, talking about femicide, talking about birth work, like Tamika said, about any good news, death in the Black community comes with a lot of trauma, right? And trauma is when we experience very stressful, frightening, or distressing events that are difficult to cope with or out of our control. This is why I talk about in death work, if you're going to be involved in death work, especially trying to support people on a professional basis, not only do you want to learn about death and the history of death, the culture of death, and also how to support grief, you need to learn about how to support trauma if you're going to be working with particularly Black people, because there's so much trauma that is involved in our deaths, not only contemporary times, but historical times. And a lot of that has not been processed. A lot of that has not been supported by society in general, right? So trauma There's traumas in our families. There's traumas in the different ways that we are socially connecting with people in schools and workplace and medical institutions. I know we've talked about in some of our previous classes religious trauma and spiritual and religious traditions, right? Environmental trauma, regional, societal, and intergenerational. There's trauma in all of those different places. Elder Wright said, truly, what is the good news? In addition to the fact that we are still here, we persevere. I love that because we really were supposed to be eradicated from this community, right? After enslavement, we were not supposed to be in existence here. We were not supposed to continue to be present in the society, which is why, society was very upset about just anything that we did and continuously created laws, continuously oppressed us and discriminated against us even to this day, because if we are not enslaved, we really are not supposed to be here. So yes, that is part of the good news. The good news is that our traditions and the ways that we support each other and the ways that we came that we exist as a community, it's the reason why we are still present. There are a lot of us still present. And that is what we need to make sure that we continue to uplift and continue to elevate for our ancestors. It's the fact that they survived. That is definitely part of the good news, is that we are still here, because if left up to society, we would have been completely mass exterminated, right? So going back earlier to the question about what is a doula. So particularly in the death community, a death keeper, which I utilize them all interchangeably. A lot of times you'll hear death doula, a lot of times that has more feminine connotation. So a lot of times I like to use death keeper or death worker, right? But they are non-medical trained professionals who can provide physical, educational, and emotional support for abortion, loss and bereavement, and general death transitioning experiences, depending on the doula's training. It's really important to know that, notate that in the doula space, it is unregulated, meaning that it doesn't have a national certifying body that you have to report to. So different people have different types of training. A lot of people, they may go through, most of the trainings that you may see, a lot of times, if it's an online training, it could be a few days, it could be up to 3 months long. And what it entails, it really is just depending on whoever is putting it on and what type of training is that person has. So if there's a particular type of thing that you're looking for, make sure that that person is trained in it and that person is providing it. But yeah, death doula work, particularly in the United States, is going to look a lot of different ways. They are all usually, supporting death, but the ways that they support death and what they provide to community can look different.
Mama Moyo, I'm sorry to interrupt. I have a question.
Go
I'm
ahead.
curious about how death doulas and hospice workers connect with each other, or how, if one has a hospice worker and a death doula, how does that work at the same time?
It just really depends. Again, because a lot of death doulas, they can also work at hospices. It depends on the culture in your region, right? So some hospices may have death doulas attached to them, and a hospice worker, if the hospice worker is doing medical, medical work, like I say, the doula does not necessarily do that medical work, but they may collaborate. So there may be, for an example, maybe they may do intake as far as figuring out, helping with end of life planning. They may do like visual work, such as, if there's certain types of scriptures they want to be read, they may communicate different messages to the families. So it just really depends. I don't necessarily know exactly what you know, because hospice workers also do different things depending on different hospices too. So it really just depends what the hospice worker is doing and also what all services the death doula has. But depending on who does what, a lot of times they definitely can collaborate.
And
Does that make
how would
sense?
it does, absolutely. Thank you for that. And how would one find a Black death doula?
Um, we'll come back to that. There's no directory for Black death doulas right now. Um, a lot of times it's just, you know, people just kind of like find us as far as, Alua author from Going with Grace. Of course, she was one of the main ones that people, you know, has been present on social media. So a lot of times people find her, and then just also just putting in Black death doulas. A lot of times people find people, of course, as we make more social connections in our community, a lot of times we're going to get, referrals. But right at this point in time, there's not like a directory like it's been done for like a lot of Black birth workers, right? So a lot of times it's just a matter of people finding us and just doing referrals, which is, that's pretty traditional, when it comes to the midwives and funeral directors that we talked about too. So I'm going to get to some of these things after I finish my presentation, okay? So yeah, a death keeper or death worker assists the client and the client's family in the preparation of the dying process and end of life planning. A death doula is often hired to help guide and educate the dying client and the family during this transition. Death keepers keep company with the dying client, and the death doulas are usually available for both the pre-death and post-death functions, including end-of-life planning vigils, terminal plans, some forms of bereavement sessions, and death anxiety navigation. Again, it just depends on the training and the education of the doula. So definitely check with what that death doula provides and the types of training that that person has, okay? Some of the things that you could do as a death worker, especially if you're wanting to incorporate Black death traditions, is being able to set up prayer and fireworking services, right? Prayer and candle services for families, communities, from 1 to 40 days after death to help guide their transition, because this is a tradition that is part of a lot of Black families and Black communities. Incorporating bedside vigils, so being there for people as they're dying, to read scriptures, to help pray for them. I talked in some of our earlier classes about providing head washes for people, foot washes for people, community vigils, especially for these different murders and shootings that are happening. Pouring libations, offering prayer and other workings to the spirits of the land in which the deceased is buried and also where they died, right? And with these lynching sites, we're talking about all this trauma and all these grief with these lynching sites. Where are the lynching sites? Where were the places where the lynching sites happen in your communities? And what can you do to help elevate those spirits? Because remember what we're talking about. Some of the traditions are, a lot of the traditions of our community is very important that they're remembered. That is part of the traditions in our community. Bringing their clothing home. Ancestral, that's part of ancestral land healing work as well. Some people like to quilt and do sculptures, which is also part of like face jugs and things as well, right? Creating memorials and artistic items out of memories. Root working for death and grief. That is definitely a space for root working and root doctoring in death and grief spaces. Pelvic steaming and other types of herbalist modalities for death and grief. Divination from the departed. So in some traditions and some religions, of course, you wait a certain amount of time for the person to get acclimated to ancestralhood or or the spirit realm, but in some traditions, it's traditional to wait like maybe like a year after they have departed, and then you can divine from the departed, right? Tree spirit medicine, so receiving direct stories of our ancestors from trees that result in formation of spiritual songs and stories. These are just some of the different things that we can do to implement some of our cultures and traditions in our work as death workers. And, going back to, like I say, communal grief rituals, because we want to not only support our individual grief, but also our communal grief. So as we said, not only do we have trauma in our stories, but there's a lot of community grief, because a lot of these things happen to us as a community. So what are we doing to elevate the spirits who died at lynching sites, elevate spirits that died from different shootings in our community, at war sites, at hospital sites, because of so much death that's happening at hospitals? What are we doing to preserve and cleanse cemeteries? Water grief rituals are already a really important part of our culture, particularly with baptisms, the initiations. And there can also be grief rituals in the water. And just setting up community shrines for a lot of these different things as well. Oh, so okay. So what is grief? Grief is the loss of something or someone, right? And there's different ways that we grieve. We have our individual grief. We also have family grief, the grief that we have in workplace, school, medical, all of these other places, but also communal, societal, ancestral, and intergenerational grief. So all of those are the different ways that we grieve, right? It can look like feeling misunderstood, feeling shame, chronic aches, anger, irritability, shock, anxiety, sleep disorders, eating disorders, sensory overload. All of those can be different presentations of grief, which is really important because there's a very distinct way that people think that we're supposed to grieve, but grief is actually very expansive, and it can encompass physical reactions, behavioral reactions, emotional reactions, and social reactions, right? It's not just about crying and feeling, down and things like that. There's ways that our body responds to grief physically, and not only just emotionally, but there's the ways that we interact with other people, not only behaviorally and socially. So that's really important for us to think about. It's just how expansive grief is, and all of those different areas of life that grief can affect, right? And some of the unique things that Black people grieve about, also comes back from the different types of deaths that we have, right? Black people were always impacted with pretty much anything in society more than other people. So there's a lot of grief around COVID-19, which Black people were affected the most, by the ways that the intersections of being Black and disabled contribute to our lives. We have the lynching and other historical types of grief, perinatal grief, because we have already talked about the different ways that people die, suicide grief, war and genocide grief, intimate partner violence grief, PTSD grief. Black people are twice as likely to have PTSD than white people. We already know about the murders, the police brutality, generational grief, Black queer grief, the intersections between being Black and queer, medical terrorism grief, and cultural grief, right? Among so many other different types of ways that we grieve. Sensory overload is when you are overwhelmed, through your senses with your environment and other different types of things. That's something that we particularly talk about, particularly in the autistic and ADHD communities, but it's not just limited to the autistic and ADHD communities. Anybody can experience sensory overload. Also, when we're talking about ATRs and ADRs, like what are some different ways that you can implement ways to support your grief? Not only in just ATRs and ADRs, whether you're Christian, whether you're Muslim, whatever it is that you relate to and connect to, prayer, prayer, meditation, libations, head washes and head feedings, root work, teas and infusions, making sure, that you are venerating your ancestors, the ways that you are implementing those different rituals that you may do with the different spirits and deities in your traditions, right? Genealogy work. Genealogy work is part of death work. That is what I talk about all the time. Cemetery cleansing, engage the different ways that you engage with nature, quilting, music, other arts. All of those are things that you can do to incorporate, you know, grief support in the work that you're doing, right? And grief and Africanisms. The important thing to remember is that our people want to be remembered. They want to be honored, right? And what is it that you can do to remember and honor our people? That is going to be the basic, thing that you want to remember when we're talking about what you can do in order to support grief, in order to process grief, not only for yourself, but to help process grief as a community. What can you do to remember your ancestors? What can you do to remember our communal ancestors? Remember them in the libations that you may do. Remember them in your holiday celebrations, by supporting the elders in your community, in your family, with the funerals that we have, with cemetery cleansings, with ancestral veneration, with memorials, with visiting and trying to uplift the spirits at lynching sites. Go to the lynching memorial that is currently in Montgomery, Alabama. Making sure to not forget the people who are being killed, who are being murdered. Maybe have a family vigil or a community vigil, practicing reconnecting to our land healing. Someone said buying ancestral land. That is also beautiful, right? Just doing genealogy work and resting, right? Just resting. Ancestral veneration and genealogy. So genealogy can not only just be family trees, it could also be family recipes. It can be clothes, the clothes that we have of the departed, right? Music and songs, a lot of our spirituals, our blues, our stories, our colors, the stories, the colors that we have in our different rituals, the occupations that a lot of our ancestors had, the gifts and the traumas. All of that is part of genealogy work. And some of those sources for American genealogy in particular, besides a lot of the ones that we know about, are the Freedmen's Bureau records. We have the Free Negro registries, or Registry of Free Negroes and Mulattoes, the cohabitation records, historic newspapers, enslaved narratives, which is something that you can find at the Library of Congress, and the 1866 state census. So those are specifically African-American sources of genealogy. Also in reference to your ancestors, some ancestors don't necessarily talk to them verbally, right? So also be mindful of the visual images, some of the things that may come up in the different ways that you pray. If you're reading the Bible, right, there may be certain things that come up for you in your dreams. Dreams is very, very, important in the Black community. And it's a big way in which a lot of times our ancestors communicate with us. In nature, some of the different scents that may come up for you, some of the different foods that you eat, music, memories. All of those are different ways that ancestors may be speaking to you, besides just the verbal, right? And yeah, I know we're running out of time, but yeah, a lot of things. Something else that I like to talk about, especially when I talk about end of life planning, is not only just documentation. A lot of times we know about documentation and needing to have, you know, whether it's power of attorneys, or those advance directives. But I also tell people just in general, because unfortunately I'm not going to probably be able to get to everything people are trying to ask me. But when you're talking about end of life planning, you not only want that documentation for as far as your advance directives, but also think about what are some of your physical needs that you feel like you're going to want? What are some social needs? What are some of the people that you want around you? If you do have certain types of sensory needs, that can be put in your inner life planning. Is there a particular type of professional that you want around you? You know, we were talking about hospice workers, doulas, midwives. There's also, you know, some of us who have, particular types of traditions and religions that we follow. You can put the fact that you want a certain type of ritual, you know, in your inner life planning. If there a particular type of ritual that you want performed, and if there's a particular type of ritual that requires a particular type of professional or spiritual leader, then that needs to be in your inner life planning. Also, you know, of course, like I say, the financial needs and desires, professional needs, all of those can be included in your inner life planning. But I want you to think about all of those different things when you are getting to your inner life planning work, and not just the documents. Okay. So some of the things that people asked, but let me go back to it. Where can one hire a death doula? There are different organizations, such as like I say, there's not a Black death doula directory that is in existence that I know about per se, but there are like different organizations like there's NITA, where you can that does have directories of death doulas. So a lot of people may find you there if it's not through word of mouth. But like I say, there's not like a Black death doula directory as of yet. I know somebody also asked about social groups. I do have the Black Deathkeeper Society on Facebook right now. So for it's mostly for people who are involved in death work, you know, currently. But you know, if you're an aspiring death keeper, then you could, you know, I'd still accept you, you know, because we're really just getting started. It's just a couple of months in existence, but it's just a place for people to talk more about death and grief and to kind of learn together and share different things. Let's see. Something else. So somebody said something about suicide. Could you say it again? I can't find you.
Unfortunately, I think that Tabitha had to leave. And Tamika also just put a statement in the chat. Suicide changes things in your death planning. For example, the insurance benefits.
Mm-hmm.
I am at work and can't speak, but it would be helpful if you can touch on unique ways to celebrate the individual without necessarily focusing on the way that he passed, but celebrating his life.
Yeah, I think that is pretty much all of those different things that we talked about earlier, right? As far as the fact that a lot of our funerals, in general, like a lot of times it is the celebration of life. And a lot of times it is not only that funeral, but also a lot of times we have that wake later on, or that second funeral that really encompasses that celebration and talk about, you know, the legacy that that person has left behind. A lot of times it has music, food, and celebrations and things like that. I don't remember exactly what it what the question was in reference to the suicide, but I would say that suicide, and I do agree in reference to like an insurance benefits, but as far as what somebody said earlier about the ways that you can celebrate somebody with suicide, I don't see how it needs to be too much differently than how we've celebrated anybody else in our society. I think that is the problem when we talk about that is what I particularly talk about when I talk about reframing suicide. Like, it should not be shame. There should not be a stigma with suicide. Somebody who, like, a lot of times in my classes when I talk about suicide, a lot of times people die by suicide because they are trying to get control of their life back in some type of way. Suicide is often political. And because we live in a society that a lot of times impress us in institutionalized ways, a lot of times people who die by suicide, a lot of times are just feel like they're boxed in a corner and are looking for any kind of way to take back control of their life. And so I teach that we should respect how a person decides to die. Yes, we're going to be sad. Yes, we're going to need to process our grief, but you need to support the ways that somebody chooses to die, and celebrate them in the same and in similar ways that you would celebrate anybody else, no matter how it is that they have died. Let's see. Thank you, Jabari. So Jabari found Nita. There is a directory there. Yeah, just like they said, it's not Black specific. Also, the Black Deathkeeper Society on Facebook, they have put the link there. So I really appreciate you, Jabari. Was there anything else? I'm trying not to miss anything.
Mama Moyo, we had one family member that was curious if the slides were going to be available. Thanks to Jabari, we know that the recording will be available, but specifically, are you open and willing to have the slides be sent out as well? And of course, completely okay if not.
Yeah, I usually don't do the slides, but I definitely usually do the recording. So I appreciate Jabari making sure that that's available.
I see.
I see somebody else have a question. Miss Bula.
Yes. I know when people die, a lot of times what they leave behind is not the best memories of them for people who they have hurt.
Mm-hmm.
And I know there's this thing of forgiveness, but forgiveness can sometimes be a process over a period of time. So when the person who has hurt you passes, it seems as though how can you be sincere about honoring this person in death? So it seems as though that would be a facade to say that you're really grieving this person when you're actually not.
Yeah, so I think that's a wonderful question. So that goes back to how grief can look differently, right? And there's something that a lot of times in the psychological community is called complicated grief. That is when your feelings about a person is complicated, right? And a lot of times we do have complicated feelings about certain parents. Maybe they were abusive. Maybe we experienced a lot of trauma from parents or from other family members, other friends, or other people. And so a lot of times grief may come in the form of we are grieving the fact that we did not have a healthy relationship with that person, and a lot of times those feelings, like I say, are a lot more complicated than just the you know, what we think about as far as, oh, this person's died, this is a loved one, you know, we really appreciate them, and these are the different ways that we may honor them. There's some people that we don't want to honor in our lives. And that also comes back, you know, to what we were talking about earlier, where some people are considered undeserving, you know, of certain, you know, things that we may do to elevate ancestors, elevate spirits. And so we decide that for ourselves, you know, as far as who we decide to honor, you know, especially as individuals, and who we don't. But also grief, like I say, it might be a lot more complicated as far as maybe this is a loved one for us, but we did experience a lot of trauma, and so we do not feel comfortable doing certain things and remembering them in certain ways right now, or maybe ever, and that is fine too. Grief can present in a variety of different ways, and all of those different ways are valid.
So I suppose if it's a deeply rooted thing, we could seek grief counseling.
Absolutely. Yes, grief counseling, therapy, that, I mean, if that's something that you want to include in your self-care and in your processing of grief, they are definitely something that you can do.
I saw that Olivia had hand up. Olivia,
Yeah.
do you still have a question or comment? You will be our last for this presentation. It may take a moment to come off of mute. Olivia, are you there to ask a question or make a comment? They may have stepped away for a moment, or maybe having a little bit of difficulty coming off mute. And so I would just like to say, on behalf of all of us here present today, Mama Moyo, thank you so much. This was just amazing, so educational, so in-depth, fascinating information that I think I and so many others of us here had not considered or been exposed to whatsoever. I hope that others would join me in welcoming you back. We'd love to have you come back for another presentation. One of the things I'm really curious about in particular is, what is a day in the life of a death doula look like? And so when someone contracts with you, what does that look like? They're the nuts and bolts of that, and how does one charge for that time? So much more that I know that you have to share with us. And I would just like to take a moment and share with our community members some of the other offerings that you have posted on your website, which is just amazing. There is a monthly community service offered for those who are moving through their time of grief due to death. Mama Moyo will reflect, pray, and complete offerings and fireworking on a person's behalf with candles or oil lamps. The service focuses on protection and cleansing, and it looks like this is a monthly offering that happens on Wednesday evening. I'll put her website in the chat once again. Another event that's happening is Alzheimer's and Dementia Intensive, ADHD grief studies, as well as autistic aging, death and grief, and also reframing Black ghosts and hauntings intensive. So these are other things that Mama Moyo is really happy to talk about, and you will find them on her website. Thank you so much for putting the website in the chat, Jabari. Much appreciated. I just wanted to circle back and just see if our Olivia is here and still has a question or comment or off of mute. Selena says, at Jabari is hired. Absolutely. We're not letting go of him. And I'm so glad that he is a student with you, Victoria, because he is a really wonderful person. And I can imagine, with all the things you presented here, what an amazing death doula he will become. Any final comments, Mama Moyo? Thank you so much. Anything that you would like to leave us with for now?
Yeah, I really appreciate you, you all for inviting me. I really appreciate you. Thank you. Thank you, Jabari. Also, yeah, so I do, like I say, the monthly classes. As far as just a variety of different classes, I usually teach the end of life planning. So if you want to do an end death group class with me. I usually try to do that 2 to 3 times a year. Moyo Mysteries is my website, particularly for a lot of my hoodoo classes. And then Spiral Birth, like I say, that's a lot where I do a lot of my birth work. And Goddess Cycles is my general death work class. So, I mean, my death work platform. So those are the different platforms that I have. But yeah, thank you. If you have any more feedback or anything that you want to reach out to me about, my email address is on Guided Cycles, but it's also vsnowden@guidedcycles.org. And I will be happy to get that with you as soon as I can. Okay.
Thank you so much, Mama Moyo. Peace and blessings to you. It has been a pleasure to have you here and listen to all the information that you've brought to us, and we look forward to having you again.
All right,
Thank you
thank
so
you.
much to your family.
Thank you. Yep. Blessings. Take care, y'all. Bye.
Peace.
Thank you.
Anyone
I hope we can
else?
connect later with her.
What was her email address?
I think I'm able to pull that up just now.
Her email address?
Yes.
You gonna put it in the chat?
Yes, will do.
Thank you all so much for hosting.
Our pleasure.
Thank you so much. Thank you for being here.
Let me see. Did you put it already or not yet?
He's doing it.
Not yet.
Oh, my bad. Sorry.
No, no problem. I'm just looking for it.
Yeah, that was pretty good.
And Jabari, you're looking specifically for email address rather than website, right?
Yes. Oh, okay, I just want to make sure. Here's her Guided Cycles email.